Yatehe. Hello, my name is Cheyenne Barefoot, and I'm an enrolled member of the Chiricahua Apache Nation. I'm a senior film and digital media major at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and today I will be providing the narration for the 1945 Coronet sponsored film, The Apache Indians. I'm doing this project partly because I want to offer an indigenous voice and an indigenous lens to an otherwise colonized space, but I'm also doing this as an act of identity reclamation. I was not fully immersed in my culture growing up due to intergenerational trauma's ripple effect. My dad kept quiet about a lot of cultural knowledge and values because talking about it ultimately unearthed a lot of dark subject matter for him. Full transparency, I don't know everything there is about my culture. In more recent years, my dad has privileged me with cultural information, and just like every other urban native, I've combed the internet for answers. For this alternative narration piece, I utilize oral knowledge and histories from my father as a primary source of contextual, cultural, and historical evidence. My aim is not to emphasize and define the activities that are taking place. Further describing them for non indigenous folks caters to the Western population's demanding ideology that the foreign be made familiar. Rather, I'm constructing a piece that is largely divergent from the visual cues and content. Let's jump right in. So, who are the Apache people? We're not the remnants of a once powerful nation like the narrator suggests. We are a powerful nation of survivors resisting the United States' attempts at eradication. We just refuse to go. Unfortunately, I can't accurately identify which Apache tribe is depicted here, and the narrator fails to distinguish them. But I think they might be White Mountain or Mescalero, actually. There are many bands within the Apache Nation. A few would be Chiricahua, Mescalero, Lipan, Jicarilla, and Kiowa. Within those tribal bands are clans. Mine is the Badonkahe. Geographically, we occupied a lot of the southwestern states, like New Mexico and Arizona, for example, but some of us were later forcibly removed from our lands as prisoners of war and relocated to parts of Oklahoma, most notably Fort Sill. Mentioned within the first minute of this video is Geronimo, or Guayacla. That's his real name, and it means one who yawns. He's actually buried at Fort Sill. This film claims he is a hero and a symbol of Apache strength, but my dad wanted me to let all of you know that there are many traditionalists who actually don't view Geronimo in this light. His stubbornness led to more deaths of Apache people, and had he just surrendered earlier, this may not have been the case. There's a lot of resentment surrounding him as a figure. This film can be divided into two parts: things that we can see and things that we can't see if we're not historically informed. So, allow me to historically inform and provide some subtext to support this new visual narrative I'm crafting for you. What's happening is the exploitation of Apache image and culture through the promotion of a distinctly colonial visual narrative for the benefit of Western education. The camera functions as a weapon to further capture and colonize the indigenous space by producing cultural signifiers that suggest this way of life is primitive and eternal, and therefore subservient. Films like this are the reason I get asked a lot of stereotypical questions about being Native American. What you don't see depicted are the traumatic experiences Apache people lived through and would continue to live through during the time this film was made and beyond. They don't mention the US government issued genocide of Native peoples, including Apaches. They don't talk about the roll call numbers that would be tattooed on the arms of women and children, not unlike what happened to Jewish people during the Holocaust. There's no mention that Native children were ripped from the arms of their parents and forced to attend boarding schools to become assimilated into white culture. They fail to mention that in addition to being stolen from their families, forced to speak English and neglect their culture, that these children were also beaten and sexually abused at these schools by the settlers. This would have happened to the baby that you'd seen on the screen. My dad specifically wanted me to express that Christianity was only introduced to Native people within the last 100 years or so, and that it was the implementation of Christianity that also furthered a lot of self hatred and cultural neglect among Native peoples, that they were not helped but changed. I want you to think back to the California mission trips your elementary schools glorified. Everything I said is what actually happened at those places. As a result, those children grew up to hate themselves for being Native American. This has affected generations of Apaches like my dad and now me. The battle scars exist even in those who didn't grow up around these atrocities. I am part of the generation who has to trace back what happened and who we are. These images are the early manifestations of that trauma. The film sensationalizes a lot of our ceremonies, and it seems pretty common even today when filmmakers produce films about Native people. It creates a spectacle for the viewer, because not only are they seeing and hearing things they would have never seen or heard before the advent of film and television, but they get to share in an experience they feel entitled to. Native Americans were not allowed to practice their sacred or religious ceremonies for close to a century. In 1883, the Bureau of Indian Affairs outlawed all such practices in what would be known as the Indian Religious Crimes Code. Offenders would be brutally punished. It wouldn't be until August of 1978 that the American Indian Religious Freedom Act would be passed, and then we'd have protection to continue our cultural practices. We were only 5 years away from an entire century of being unable to practice our ceremonies publicly, of being forced to conduct them in secret. This is one of the many ways the United States government has tried to crush our spirit, but this, of course, isn't mentioned within this film. It makes me wonder if this particular community got the green light to do the sunrise ceremony. The narrator calls it a puberty dance. I've also heard it called a rite of passage. It's what you see before you right now. As I understand it, puberty age girls would dance from sunup until sundown in a ceremony that would continue for 4 days to symbolize becoming a woman. And there's usually a lot of food and singing, and the spirit dancers would come out to do a dance as well. The narrator actually does a decent job of elaborating on it. It seems like he consulted with somebody. My explanation is a little rushed and unconfident. My dad used to explain it differently to me. I grew up thinking I'd be covered in bee pollen, which some images do depict some sort of white or yellow powder on either their entire face or their entire head, having to dance for 3 days straight, and then would have to make a bee pollen cake for the whole community. I don't think that latter part is true, though. I never got to do my sunrise ceremony, but I'll link a video that was created last year of a modern sunrise ceremony so you can get a richer perspective than the one that's depicted in this film. As we near the end of this alternative narration, we need to question this film's purpose and exactly who this is useful for. There isn't a lot of information about this film. All I really know about it is what's on the title cards. One might think, based on the research I've done, that this film is merely supposed to be an accessible visual piece that educates about the traditional cultural customs and ceremonial practices of the Apache people. And yes, this is a fine, good-intentioned purpose. But when we recontextualize what's happening here, when we listen to the diminutive comments by the narrator regarding social practices and gender, when we analyze even the way the camera intrusively focuses on the two Apache women eating their meal, the purpose we extrapolate is one that aims to keep indigenous peoples submissive and Western culture dominant. Coronet aimed to keep this particular image of Apache people in the minds of future Western generations and to keep them in their place. This film was not made for Apache people, not for young Apache students. The information in this film is a privilege for people to learn. Indigenous people have had to fight for the preservation and practice of our cultural knowledge, yet this film hands it over to Western people because they wanted to learn about us. They had a choice as to whether or not they wanted to consume our image, but we didn't have a choice in whether or not we wanted to consume theirs. Despite the settler colonialism, despite the United States government, despite every effort made by Western society to quell our voices, we are still here. We're ready now, more than ever, to talk over the false narratives, the misinformation, the disinformation, the stereotypes. We're here to deliver the hard truths you won't learn about in a textbook or in a lecture hall. We're here to provide you with the information we want you to know. I want you to know that our histories didn't die in the firelight and our image is not the one you've seen before you. Your new image is me talking over this film, breaking down those barriers and confirming that we are not outdated. We did not die. We are here. Kadishte.